I arrived in the middle of a gigantic trucker strike and small business strike, so the country was basically shut down. The only way I could get in from the airport was on a municipal bus, which dropped me off near the defense ministry, now that I think about it. And from there I was able to get, finally got a taxi, 1947 Ford, that took me to the house where I was staying. Nothing was, no businesses were open to speak of. Pretty much everything was shut down. But then that gradually was overcome over the period of like 2 or 3 weeks, and then things kind of came back to normal. The basic reality of Chile at that moment, aside from that particular conflict, we didn't know what was happening. We knew that this was serious. We knew that there was incredible opposition from the internally. We knew the United States was very hostile to this experiment. But our life in Chile was joyful. It was a lot of fun. I mean, I wasn't that young. I think I was already 30 years old. But the intellectual stimulation, the meetings, the voluntary work, there were many places where you would go and meet other people, other foreigners, other Chileans. Chileans are very open people. They were a little bit suspicious of Americans, but it was like, well, we're worried about Americans, not you, because you're our friend, but we're worried that other Americans might be CIA agents. So there was always that context, but basically very open, warm, embracing people. And the optimism of young people at the time was contagious. And we talked a lot about politics. We talked about Marx and Lenin. We analyzed Lenin and analyzed Lenin and analyzed Lenin. The state and revolution. I mean, this was the dialogue. How do you prognosticate, right? How do you figure out what's going to happen? What should be done? Both by the people, by the government, the political parties. These are questions that were being debated in the cafes and the streets. The UNCTAD, we called it, the gigantic building, which is now known as the GAM, was created for the meeting of the United Nations, UNCTAD, I can't remember what it stands for now. It was a United Nations meeting which took place in Chile, and they built this building for it. And then after, in 1971 or 72, earlier, and then the building became a cultural center. And that was where everybody met. I mean, you would go down there all the time. There were cafes, and there were big conferences that were open to everybody. It was just a very stimulating experience. And of course, polarized, because you didn't meet right-wingers, you didn't meet people from Providencia unless they were supporters of the Providencia is the upper-class neighborhood that's very close to downtown Santiago. You were in a kind of bubble, which we realized later, of people that all supported the experiment, and were there, to understand, to think it through, but also many of the foreigners were there to help. Experts in agrarian reform, Salom Baraclo from the University of Wisconsin, Jacques Chonchol, of course he was binational, André Gunder Frank, major thinker in development, dependency theory, people talking about liberation theology, a German guy named Hinkelammert gave courses at the University of the Catholic University, which I attended briefly, and that's where I met Frank Teruggi, who we'll talk about later, the American that was later killed. it was economists and a lot of economists, now that I think about it. Yeah, political scientists, but political scientists who were very concrete thinkers, who were really trying to think through how this process is going to operate. I mean, even political scientists are flabbergasted when they're in a situation where none of this has ever happened before. Nobody had ever done a Marxist revolution respecting democracy. And I guess it's important to say that that was not a facade. That was absolutely the groundwork principle of the Allende government, and certainly of Salvador Allende. And when there were choices that had to be made that would have required him to depart from respect for democracy, he always pushed back against many of his supporters, many of his members of his own coalition, who wanted to become more radical, who wanted to distribute arms, for example, and he always refused. He always said, this is a revolution in democracy, and that's why, that's how we're unique. So there was no intellectual, there was no theoretical framework to try to understand this situation. Everybody was understanding it as it was happening.